There's going to be a lot of players in the league next season who are stepping into bigger roles, who have a lot to prove, or are going to be pretty interesting to watch for one reason or another. And I decided, during the offseason, while we're getting ready and hyped up for the next NBA season, I'm going to talk about one player from every team that I think is going to be their most interesting player for next season. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Court Vision. In this video, I'm going to be starting off with the Eastern Conference. I decided to split this up into two videos because it was going to be a pretty big, long project if I did it all as one. So yeah, in this one, I'm just going to talk about the East. Remember to like the video and subscribe if you want to see more content like this throughout the offseason and then going into the next NBA season. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with the Atlantic Division, I'm going to talk about the Boston Celtics first, just alphabetically first overall. And I think this is going to be one of the most obvious picks on this entire list, and that's obviously Jaylen Brown, right? With Tatum out with the Achilles injury this season, he's going to have a ton of responsibility. And, historically, I was kind of a Jaylen Brown denier. I was kind of a hater because I didn't think what his strengths were necessarily as good as people were saying. I thought he was kind of overrated, and I didn't think he was super good outside of his scoring and ability to be an offensive player. But my opinion of him has definitely improved since their championship run. Him being a super high impact, high energy defender, and his ability to scale up and down and fill different roles based on what the team needs at him at any given moment. I think that really makes him a lot more valuable than I previously gave him credit for. And I think this year is going to be his chance to prove that he can scale up and be the real go-to number one guy on his team for a full season. He's going to be more of an initiator and a ball handler. We're going to see really how his passing looks. Throughout his career, his passing hasn't really been a key part of his game. But, with Tatum being out, obviously, he's going to have a lot more responsibility as an initiator and a passer. After Tatum went down in that series against the Knicks, last couple bits of that series, he really did show some flashes of being a real driver of offense, obviously in a really small sample size. So we're going to have to see what he can do next season. And also I want to see how he holds up as a scorer with, more defensive attention on him, without Tatum next to him to take that kind of away a little bit. And I think really Boston's season and whether or not they can actually really make noise and try to be good in this Eastern Conference next season is going to come down to Jaylen Brown and his level where he's at leading this team, along with some other guys stepping up into bigger roles. Moving over down to the Brooklyn Nets, I want to talk about Cam Thomas. I was torn between Yegor Jimin, I think that's how you say it, is Jimin, and Cam Thomas, but I ultimately went with Cam because I think this is really going to be a big kind of, not make or break, but it's going to be a big year in terms of his development, and it's really going to swing my opinion of him based on, where he improves and where he doesn't improve going into this season. Throughout his career, I think he's proven his ability as a contested shot maker and just a scorer on the ball. But where a lot of the concerns with a guy like Cam Thomas lie is whether or not he can do enough outside of his scoring to be a real positive on the floor, whether he can provide enough value on both ends of the floor to be a really high-level player, because all of his defensive metrics in the past couple seasons were well below average for his position, which obviously makes it hard to play him for super heavy minutes. And his passing is also not really to the level that you would want it to be for someone as ball dominant as he is. When you look at his stats and you see, he has a 95th percentile assist percentage, which is pretty good. But when you consider that he was 100th percentile in usage, literally the highest usage of any player in the league last season, for his position, obviously. His assist to usage ratio is actually below the positional average for other wings. To put that into perspective, he's comparable in terms of assist to usage to a guy like Christian Brown, whereas Cam Thomas has monumentally more touches. So you'd really like to see his passing and his vision in that aspect of the game improve next season. So basically his season next year is all about whether or not he can improve defensively, improve as a passer, make those changes that he needs to in his game, or if he doesn't do that, because if he can, I think he'll be able to earn my attention and earn some of the hype from me. But otherwise, I don't think I can continue to necessarily believe in him being a future star player in the league if he can't improve on those glaring flaws. Moving over down to the New York Knicks, I think the guy for them is going to be Karl Anthony Towns. The Knicks in general don't necessarily have individual players that I'm super interested in going into this next season, but rather the change in the offensive system as a whole is what interests me under the new coach Mike Brown. And I think Cat is going to be the most interesting guy for this team simply because I think he's the one who stands to have the most different utilization and the biggest benefit from this change offensively. Tom Thibodeau didn't necessarily use Karl Anthony Towns to the highest level, his full potential offensively. And I think in this new system with Mike Brown, who's a great offensive coach, if they can utilize more of his game playing off of Jalen Brunson together, or him being more of that spacing and shooting threat and defense or kind of defense bender that he can be, I think will definitely bolster his offensive game. And it's going to be really interesting to see how he's used in this new offense. For the Toronto Raptors, this was definitely one of the harder picks on this list for me because there were two guys that I was torn between, and that's Brandon Ingram and Immanuel Quickley. Immanuel Quickley is interesting because of how, injuries have kind of derailed his tenure on the team, and there are a lot of questions about his level of play, whether he's worth the contract that they gave him, what his fit is with the other guys on the team. But I ended up going with Brandon Ingram simply because I think he's really a huge swing factor for the Raptors going into this next season. He's stepping into this team as presumably the highest, usage scorer, taking the most shots probably on the team. And I'm curious to see not only how he handles an increased offensive role from some of his previous teams, like in New Orleans and in LA before that, but also how he fits next to Scotty Barnes. I think depending on the level of scoring that we're going to get out of Brandon Ingram, that's going to determine a lot for how Scotty Barnes necessarily is going to need to be used. And if he's going to be good as a scorer, it's going to take some of that scoring burden off of Scotty Barnes and allow Scotty to thrive more as a defender and a playmaker, which I think are some of his real skills. So I think that makes Brandon Ingram super interesting to me, not only because of his own offensive game, but how he affects the game of other guys around him. And I also think that Toronto needs this Ingram signing to work, right? They invested a lot to bring him in and gave him that big contract. This swing kind of tells me that they want to be more competitive team in this Eastern Conference. And if he has that big impact like they're hoping he can, they might be able to make a push for a playoff spot with his addition, with some better health and some more development from some other guys. So I really think Brandon Ingram is going to be super interesting in how he affects the Raptors next season. The last team in the Atlantic Division is going to be the Philadelphia 76ers. And man, I really have no idea what to make of this team going into next season. They've got a couple of older win now guys who are unfortunately injury prone in Joel Embiid and Paul George. But then they also have this group of really exciting younger talent with, Tyrese Maxey, Quentin Grimes, Jared McCain, and now VJ Edgecombe. Any of these guys, these six guys, the older guys or the younger guys, could have been my pick for the most interesting guy for the Philadelphia 76ers. But I'm going to go with VJ Edgecombe for kind of two reasons. One, I don't necessarily think Philly is going to end up having the right health, the right circumstances to be able to compete. And therefore, the future is what I'm interested in. And then out of those future guys, I picked VJ because he is the most kind of interesting part of that future, if that makes sense. Tyrese Maxey is more of a known quantity, and I don't think Quentin Grimes and Jared McCain necessarily have the same ceiling as a guy like VJ Edgecombe based on what we saw out of him at Summer League. So I think he's going to be the most interesting part of the young core for the Sixers going forward. His athleticism, his defensive talent and effort, combined with some of the really refined looking scoring game that we saw out of him in Summer League, make me think his ceiling might actually be much higher than anyone really anticipated. And so regardless of how the team looks around him, I'm very excited to see his development, how he looks playing real heavy NBA minutes, maybe even as a starter for this team going forward. His game and how he looks is going to keep me tuning in, even if the rest of the team falls apart around him. Now moving over to the Central Division, starting with the Cleveland Cavaliers. The guy for them, for me, is going to be Evan Mobley. There were a couple different ways you could go with the Cavs and who their most interesting guy would be. If you want to look at it from impact on the team ceiling, it's probably going to be a guy like Darius Garland if he can stay healthy, things like that. Or if you want to look at an interesting new addition, you could talk about Lonzo Ball. But I ended up going with Evan Mobley because, as you can probably tell by this point in the video, I'm super interested in player development and guys who are taking jumps. And Evan Mobley, in my opinion, is the most interesting guy for the Cavs in that respect. His offensive game last season took a huge jump with the new coach, Kenny Atkinson. He was getting more opportunities to work on the ball and to be utilized within the offense as a real piece. And I think that trend is going to continue. Just the ability that he started to show last year to just muscle his way to the rim, use his body, his insane length to kind of score over guys, score through guys at the rim was night and day compared to his first couple seasons in the league. Him continuing to develop as a scorer is something that really, really makes me excited. And on top of that, he was literally the DPOY last year, and his defense should continue to be elite, combined with that offensive game I talked about and his emerging ability to be a real floor spacer and have that outside shot. All of this just makes him such an interesting player. I really think this guy could end up having like an all-star, all-defense kind of season, and I'm very excited to see him next year. For the Indiana Pacers, if I had to describe their next season in one word, it would probably be hiatus. It feels like they're kind of taking a break from competing after losing Tyrese Halliburton with the Achilles injury, and then after losing Miles Turner in free agency as well. But with that step back and that kind of hiatus from competing comes some opportunity from some other guys to expand their game and prove themselves. And I think there are three guys who fit into that. Andrew Nembhard, probably going to be the point guard, real initiator for this team. A guy like Jarris Walker potentially stepping into a big role after being injured for part of last season. And then Benedict Mathurin stepping into a big role, probably going to be the fifth starter now in the lineup. And I'm going to go with Benedict Mathurin as my pick for the Pacers' most interesting players, because while those other guys are going to have bigger roles, I think Mathurin has the most to prove going into this season. People typically have thought of Mathurin as kind of a one-dimensional scorer, but I don't think, based on what we saw in the second half of last season and in the playoffs, that this is really true anymore. I think he was far more bought into his role within the team and showed huge improvements in his defensive focus and effort. I think he was able to find his way to fit into their offense as kind of a play finisher, or being a scorer within the flow of the offense and capitalizing on the opportunities that were created for him, rather than necessarily being a ball stopper and trying to do everything himself. So I think if he can continue to maintain that defensive focus and that kind of lock into the team system while having that bigger role in the starting lineup and taking on more responsibility as a scorer and ball handler with Tyrese Halliburton out, I think he is poised to have a career year, both in terms of his numbers and also in terms of how people perceive him. Now to the easiest pick on the list, the Milwaukee Bucks. It's Giannis, right? It's obvious, just because of the lack of really anyone else on the team who interests me. I don't necessarily think the Bucks are going to be as bad next season as people think. And I think that's going to be entirely because of Giannis and just the level that he's at. I think we're going to see him running the offense more with the ball in his hands, kind of being point Giannis, and potentially having some of the highest usage of his career. And I think him and his ability to do stuff on the floor, both as a scorer and a passer, is enough to give the Bucks a really high floor in the regular season. He's an unstoppable downhill threat. His passing is unironically elite. If you really have been locked in, especially towards the end of last season, just the strides he's made as a playmaker are very, very interesting to me. And I just think that, with the gravity that he has, he's going to create so many easy opportunities for other guys around him that it almost doesn't matter who's on the floor next to him. The team is just going to be solid enough just because of Giannis. Going over to the Detroit Pistons, this is probably another pretty easy one, and that's going to be Jaden Ivey is my pick for them. The Pistons last season took a pretty huge leap in terms of their level as a team, with Cade, rising up and becoming a real superstar, and bringing in a lot of competent players around him. But they clearly needed another guy who can score and be kind of a secondary ball handler in that starting lineup if they want to, take another jump and really, make deeper playoff runs. And we're going to see if Jaden Ivey is that guy this season. He missed a lot of last year with that injury, and his level this year alongside Cade Cunningham is not only going to determine how much noise Detroit can make in the playoffs this year, but also I think the long-term construction of the team. If it doesn't look good with him next to Cade going into this season, I think it's going to give Detroit some of the knowledge that they need to make that decision long term in who their second guy is going to be next to Cade Cunningham. If he doesn't look great with Jaden Ivey this year, I think Detroit knows exactly who they need to ship out and then what they need to get in return for that. And that's going to be Jaden Ivey going out if he can't perform alongside Cade this season. So all of that makes it kind of a make or break, or not make or break. I don't think that's necessarily fair. Not make or break for his career, but make or break for him and his fit on this Detroit Pistons team. Now for the Chicago Bulls, there's really not any players on this roster that excite me a ton, except for one guy, and that's going to be Modest Buzelis. He had a very exciting rookie season last year. A lot of people were calling him the steal of the draft, and he's going to continue to have even more opportunity to play and develop next season. And he's probably going to be really the only reason I tune into the Bulls at all, outside of like the obligation I have to just watch every team at least a little bit. So for all those reasons, and really for lack of other choices, it's got to be Modest Buzelis. Moving right along to the Southeast Division, the first team for this division is going to be the Orlando Magic. The thing that intrigues me most about the Orlando Magic as a team is kind of the continuing story around the fit between Franz Wagner and Paolo Banchero. They're both super talented in their own ways, but their ability to play next to each other kind of long term has kind of been in question, and that's really been the central narrative around this team over the last couple of seasons, and it will probably continue to be that way this season. And I think Franz Wagner is going to be the most interesting guy to watch out of those two, simply because it's going to be that make or break year for those two as a duo. With the East being as open as it is, with the big move that they made to bring in Desmond Bane, I think it's going to be necessary for this year for them to figure it out as a duo. And Franz is the one with more to prove, right? Paolo's clearly the guy. They just give him that big extension. So if either of them are going to have to get moved after the season, it will be Franz. So it is kind of make or break for his tenure with this Orlando Magic team. His ability to be a consistent three-point shooter, and then him and Paolo being able to play off of each other or play off ball kind of in general will kind of be the key factors determining if the duo will work long term. And I'm very interested to see. And so just for the rules of this video, the one player for each team, I'm going to say Franz Wagner, but really it's about the fit with him and Paolo and how those two can work together. For the Atlanta Hawks, a team that's very interesting to me as a whole going into next season, they made a couple big moves in this offseason, and the most interesting of those moves for me was the addition of Kristaps Porzingis, and that's going to make him the most interesting player to watch for me going into next season for this team. We all know his health concerns, kind of the struggle that KP brings, to any team he joins, but we also all know how valuable he can be when he is healthy. Just the versatility and the skill that he adds to a team on both ends of the floor really, really can raise the ceiling of the Hawks substantially. And it could be the difference between the Hawks, being a real threat to, potentially contend for the Eastern Conference and maybe make the NBA Finals if he's healthy, So I think the team will be more interesting as a whole with him out there on the floor. And if he isn't, that's still probably going to be a central narrative for the team is his health. And so the fact that it's a contract year for him as well, just the one season left on his deal, also means it's a real do or die season for him as an individual, which kind of just adds to the interest. And for all those reasons, it's definitely got to be KP. For the Miami Heat, they're kind of an interesting team to think about and look at in general. And the philosophy that I've kind of been rocking with for making these picks for each team's most interesting player kind of depends on the state of the team, right? For teams that are looking to compete right now, I've been focusing more on players who are going to be important to the success of the team, this season. And then for teams that are kind of rebuilding or retooling, I'm looking at guys who are looking to either solidify their spot on the roster or who are going to be potentially important building blocks for that team. The Miami Heat aren't really in either of these groups. They're not necessarily competing immediately, but they're also not really rebuilding. And so for that reason, it made this pick kind of hard. So I decided to go with the most unknown factor, and that's going to be the rookie Kasparas Jakučionis. The Heat have been desperate for a passer, an initiator to play alongside with and be able to set up guys like Tyler Hero and Bam Adebayo. And Jakučionis could potentially be that guy. He's probably the best passing prospect in this draft class, and how much ability or how much impact he's going to be able to have in his rookie season could potentially have a big impact on this Miami Heat team as a whole. And on top of that, I just like him as a prospect, and I'm excited to see him play regardless of the team context. So for those reasons, I'm going to pick him as the most interesting player for the Heat. For the Charlotte Hornets, you probably already know who I'm going to say. It's got to be LaMelo Ball. I mean, this is really going to be it for him, right? This is the season that he needs to prove that he can really be the superstar center of the team. We know his talent is there as a scorer, as a passer, but his problems have always been with efficiency, with chucking up shots, with concerns about if he's really able to do what he does and contribute to a serious competitive basketball team. And I think this season, health of the team permitting, he's going to have the most real situation that he's ever had in his career. So I think this is the season that he's going to really need to show that he can be that centerpiece of the team, be that superstar as the Hornets look to actually finally get this rebuild off the ground. I don't think I can continue to give him the benefit of the doubt if he really isn't able to prove something to me this year. So I'm excited. He can definitely prove that he's that guy, and he can also definitely prove that he maybe isn't that guy, if you get what I mean. Now for the last team in the Eastern Conference, last but certainly not least, are my Washington Wizards. And I'm probably biased, but there are so many players on this team that I'm very interested in, that I really want to keep an eye on this season. But out of all of those guys, I'm going to go with Trey Johnson, just because I think he's going to have the biggest impact on the team's outlook going forward as this rebuild progresses. The Wizards' young core has a lot of guys that are strong defenders or maybe good playmakers or have these other skill sets, but they really don't have a real scoring talent in that young core. And Trey Johnson is just that, a real incredibly talented scorer who could end up having a really high ceiling in that role. And so if he really is the truth, if he really can bring that juice as a bucket getter that they need in this young core, he could end up being potentially one of the most important players on this team as this rebuild progresses. And on top of that, dude is straight up just fun to watch. He's so talented, able to get to the rim, has a floater game, mid-range jumpers, deep threes, pull-ups, off the catch. He can just do it all. And for those reasons, he's definitely going to be the guy that I pick for the Wizards. And that is every Eastern Conference team's most interesting player for the 2025-26 NBA season. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Like the video and subscribe if you want to see more. And I will see you guys very soon for part 2 of this for the Western Conference. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you, and have a good day.